I'm SJ Terp, and I'm speaking together with Roger Johnson, and we're part of CogSec Collab. We work on InfoSec approaches to disinformation, and we're going to talk today about disinformation risk management and our work on disinformation SOCs and how they work together with information SOCs. So, a few definitions. First, we've already spoken about this one. So this is the 3 layers of security. Cybersecurity, the boxes and wires that we know and love. Physical security, you can just steal the box. And we've added cognitive security, which is where we can think of human communities as being like networks, with the endpoints being human brains, beliefs, feelings, etc. So what we're talking about when we talk about cognitive security are ways to attack belief systems. So that includes disinformation. So this idea that you're deliberately influencing perceptions, decision makings, emotions, especially across groups, large scales. And you're doing this by presenting information that is untrue or it's incomplete, or you're doing it out of context. So in this case, the falsehood could be either in the content, but also in the context around it. Things like deliberate amplifications using botnets is a falsehood in context. Misinformation is misleading or incorrect information. So these are the misinformation narratives. For example, we just had a year of COVID-19 narratives where things like false cures, narratives around vaccines. So unleading misinformation is a content-based problem usually. Malinformation, again with true information, but it's generally things like hack and leaks. So you're using true information, putting it out of context. We've also been looking at hate speech. We've done a fair bit around some of this, but for most of this talk, we're going to be talking about disinformation and misinformation. So we're here to talk about disinformation risk. And how do you do disinformation risk management? How do you do, starting with disinformation risk assessment? And we're talking this section about how you do the landscaping. So what is the environment that you're trying to do risk management within? So risk landscaping. Well, the first thing in here is you want to manage the risks, not the artifacts. So when I say artifact, I mean things like text messages, images, accounts, connections between them. Here we're looking instead at what is going wrong, who is it going wrong to, what are the intentions, what are the attack surfaces that we're presenting, what are vulnerabilities to disinformation, what are our potential losses, what are the outcomes that we might have, and then looking at how we manage that. So how do we assess that, how do we reduce that through mitigation, and if we get disinformation affecting us, how do we do remediation on this, either during incidents or post-incident? Risks, classic things, how bad, times how likely, who's it to. So this isn't much of a surprise. But the reason we're doing this and looking at it this way is that we're reaching a point where there's misinformation, disinformation pretty much everywhere. So we have a resource allocation problem. Quite often we have multiple narratives coming in, we get multiple data coming in, and we have to work out where to focus our efforts. And that's across detection efforts, that's across mitigation efforts, that's across responses. But we have resources, the usual collection of people, technologies, time, but also attention. So time turns out to be important. And we also have connections. So the politics of response is important too. So, landscapes. Talked a little bit about risk just now. Before we get to that point, we need to start looking at what the problem is. So we have these 3 landscapes, and I've been using this in deployments recently, and it seems to work. So we're looking at what is the information landscape that cognitive security problems appear in. So this idea of where are people looking for information? Where are they sharing that information? It's not necessarily the same place. It's not just Twitter and Facebook anymore. I mean, I look at places that the information is coming in through places like Facebook, but it's going out through places like WhatsApp. Looking at the information sources, again, that's not necessarily the same as where the people are. And one of the things that creates is information voids. So a void is somewhere where people are looking for information, but it doesn't exist. And these are ripe for disinformation. The void might be URLs, it might be subject, it might be a demographic, it might even be a hashtag, but it's somewhere there's space, and you need to spend a lot of time gardening that space. The threat landscape. So this is the one most people are mapping. So who is out there? What are their motivations? We're looking at scales ranging from individual through businesses to country scales, country and regions. So who might be out there? What might they be trying to do? Where is disinformation appearing to start? So what are the sources? What are the starting points? Attribution is hard. Tracking back to where things came from is difficult, but it's a useful exercise. And also looking at effects. So not just where is this coming from, but what is it doing? Both intended and unintended. And behind that, you're looking at things like what are the misinformation narratives in this space? What sort of hateful speech? By the way, hate speech, I like this change to this idea of hateful speech. It seems to be an important definitional change. And what are the crossovers? Not just in what you have at the moment and your own threat surfaces, but how can incidents from elsewhere affect your organization, country, etc. as well. Also looking as part of that threat landscape of behaviors, so tactics, techniques. We've spoken a lot about the AMET models for that, and looking at what the artifacts in that space are. But having thought about information threat landscape, the thing that most people miss is the third landscape, which is the response landscape. So who's actually out there? So who is monitoring? Who is countering? Again, they're not necessarily the same groups. Is there coordination between them? Can you improve that coordination? We'll talk about that in a minute. Part of response is things like policies, technologies, again, behaviors. So we have an AMET model that covers counter behaviors. And again, three things. If you only take one thing away from this, is that if you want to understand disinformation in environment, it helps to understand the information, the threat, and the response landscapes, all three of those. So one thing we've been working on is this idea of disinformation security operation centers. We have a groups of organizations, response organizations, that we think will need to cooperate with each other, but we need mechanisms for them to be able to do this. And SOCs seem to be a good model for that. And in the best CogSec collab tradition, we look at InfoSec, see what they've got that's useful, drag it over to disinformation. So what do we mean by disinformation SOC? So let's first look at some of the actors we have in this. From the disinformation side, we think we have three different scales. So we have large, resourced, practiced, persistent manipulators. So we're talking teams like the well-known team, the Internet Research Agency. We're talking things like the China, Iran, nation state level teams. We've also got persistent manipulators that are things like the anti-vax networks of websites. So the anti-vaxxers are persistent. We've got pink slime sites. These are networks of fake local news organizations. And the last persistent manipulator we've got out there is the nation state media. So Sputnik RT, organized by one country, basically aimed at another. In the middle size, we've got service providers. So these are more business-like. We're looking at the disinformation as a service industry. So we're talking about disinformation factories. So businesses that will, for a fee, run disinformation incidents for you. We're looking at groups that have pivoted from things like marketing, because disinformation is basically marketing gone bad, and spam. We're not seeing as many as we originally expected of these. We think that's because ransomware is still worth more money, but it's definitely a growing market. And we're also seeing this phenomenon of ad hoc teams that are being paid to produce disinformation. So for example, EBLL Guyana, that was a fake nonprofit where a group of people were paid to post at Black Americans. Peace Data America, again, this was an organization that carried disinformation, but used genuine journalists, genuine American journalists. So the final scale, the smaller scale, we're looking at the opportunists. So we're looking at people selling stuff. Basically, last year, most of the disinformation tracking we did, we'd see an instant start. And it might start with the persistent manipulators, the service providers, or somewhere else. But then we'd see a lot of people turn up selling stuff. They're either attracting people to their websites for the clicks, or they're selling t-shirts. We saw a lot of t-shirts, books, speaking, whatever. But they're basically grabbing a free ride on top of the original disinformation campaign. And we're seeing the groups, conspiracy groups, extremists who have been using disinformation as part of their group cohesions, the in-group, out-group stuff. And we're seeing individuals. Individuals have always been there. You get the attention seekers, people doing it for a joke. But that's basically your scale. It's like big, well-funded, well-resourced, practiced, advanced teams, business teams, and this smaller scale. But there's also a similar group. So most people just look at the disinformation actors, but you've also got the response actors. So if you're modeling, you need to be looking at this side too. Again, different scales. So on the large scale, you've got organizations like platforms that are very large. You have dedicated disinformation teams. You've got ISALs. ISALs and ISACs already existing in InfoSec. We tried creating a cognitive security ISAL and encouraging one. I don't think there's still space there for coordinating bodies across organizations, across verticals to do pretty much all the same things in terms of sharing, etc. that ISALs do. And there are other large actors in this space. So we're talking the very big scale. Also on that scale, we have the war rooms that are set up around events like elections. So large numbers of people concentrating very hard, often from different organizations, different places. And again, these are resourced in terms of people, resources, technologies, whatever, and they're large. Middle size, we think, is the scale that we're going to be seeing in businesses. So this is, for us, we're looking at not necessarily a full-scale SOC, but something about the size of a disinformation desk. And we've seen a lot of standalone units. Quite often it's a working group of some sort. It's been pulled together from legal, health, platform safety, etc. Sometimes it's a small group that's been set up in an organization. So we see these as standalone units, but we think that if you look at it right, you can actually embed them into existing InfoSec SOCs. So part of the work we've been doing is how do you do that? And we're also seeing teams of journalists, academics, independent researchers, investigators. We've seen those around for a while. So again, you have this teamwork and disinformation. If you start seeing hybrid threats, how do you connect those to InfoSec? How do you connect those out to other teams they need to work with? Responders, the smaller scale. So here you're talking about individuals. Individuals are not up all the time. Policymakers or enforcement, the groups that can make a difference in disinformation, that can act, that can monitor, but aren't necessarily SOC-sized or SOC team-sized. So, response actors. One thing we've been doing is looking at response actors around the world. So we've pulled together a bunch of different lists of organizations and teams that are responding to disinformation or that are monitoring disinformation. And we mapped them by country, and we went looking to see which ones had volunteers within them, because we like to connect volunteers. So by doing this, you start getting a sense of what the response capacity is in a country. And this works not just at looking at countries, but you can also do this for looking at businesses or verticals or other segmentations of your world. So is the segmentation you're looking at, I mean, in this case, countries, does the capacity available and the work that that capacity does match the problem that exists? And does it have surge capacity if the problem changes? So for instance, we have countries where misinformation is the main problem. They haven't really dealt with much disinformation yet. And if disinformation turns up, there's going to be an issue. So connect up. We found hundreds of groups. We've got sort of like 600 on here. We've got more. And they all have different focuses. So how do we connect them? How do we facilitate the collaboration, communication between them? It's not compulsory, but you know, if we can do this, how do we do it? And one of the ideas we had was this idea of cognitive security SOCs, so CogSOCs. And we think they have a set of roles. We took the list that the CTI League used for its InfoSec work, and we looked at how that applied back to disinformation. So if you think of the CTI League as a big SOC and the disinformation team embedded in it as a disinformation SOC, a disinformation desk within it, what are the things it does? And inform. So like all SOCs, you're summarizing, you're sharing information about incidents that are happening. So this is very tactical. This isn't the big level strategic of top level attributions. It's what do we do whilst the incident's happening? Neutralization is part of that. You want to do instant response. So you're going through a triage, you're doing takedown, you're escalating to people who can do responses you can't. And before that, you'd like to do prevention as well. So not just wait until a disinformation incident happens, but how do you look for your own vulnerabilities? How do you look at your indicators of compromise? How do you start reducing your threat surfaces? Support. It's thinking about what the possibility of direct attack, in last year's case, it was in hospitals and other medical institutions. But what's the possibility? What could it look like? How could you be ready for that? Again, with the risks. Likelihood is important. And then this clearinghouse function. If you've got all this data going through you anyway, you may as well find a way to collate and share that information, and including those response and counter-campaign organizations. So top level activities. If you're going to create a CogSOC, what do you need to do? Well, the very first thing is you've actually got to make it possible to do this. So you have foundation work. There's a lot of data engineering work you have to do. It's nice to just send each other messages and emails saying something's going on, but really would like to store that, because you have lots of different levels of information. It gets messy. So backing that up is, what are the formats you use for doing that? So what are the information frameworks? There's a whole bunch of InfoSec frameworks. We've worked a lot on modifying things like sticks and attack for disinformation use, training, but also the politics of how do you get groups to share nicely without anyone feeling they've lost something. So enablement, make this thing possible. And before you start handling disinformation, or actually probably at the same time, but you're doing risk mitigation. It's a slower system. you're looking at, you have a system you're trying to secure. So there are things like doing red teaming. We've done the red teaming exercises every week last year on looking ahead to what threats might be by the usual thing of thinking what you might do if you were the bad guys. Pen testing, simulations, exercises, they all still work in disinformation too. And this compliance part. So we're talking to a few governments, and there will be regulations. I mean, I don't think there is any argument there will be some form of, not necessarily rules, but certainly guidelines, and we will probably see compliance similar to InfoSec compliance happening for disinformation. So have you done these mitigation steps? Do you have an action plan if disinformation hits you? Do you have connection set up, etc.? So that is under mitigation because we think that's going to come soon. And then there's the real-time operations. So this is one most people see as the sexy stuff of the stuff is coming in, you have to respond to it. But it's that triple thing of discovering the disinformation in the first place. I mean, if you're a business, how do you find out where the disinformation about you is in the first place? Investigating that. And then how do you respond? Again, response or pass on, but those three parts, an instant response. And then that deeper level research, threat intelligence, deep investigations. Again, corollaries all the way down. You know this stuff. It just applies over to disinfo too. So it's the enablement part. You've got all of the data governance, you've got all of the data engineering behind this, there's some data science, but you've also got this frameworks and standards part. So we've talked about this before again, but just recap. This idea that there are layers of a disinformation incident. So an incident is generally an event that takes place over a short number of days. Some of them are up and down in a couple of days, sometimes they're hours, sometimes they're a little longer. But generally you're looking at something that a team has created, a team is on for a short amount of time and it goes off and does something else. That might be part of a longer term campaign. So when we talk about advanced threats, the incident might be part of COVID-19 vaccination chaos. It might be part of election campaign. But the incident itself will sit generally on a set of narratives. So the stories that you tell yourself about yourself, which is identity narratives, the stories that you tell about the groups that you do and don't belong to, the in-group, out-group, and then the world narratives about what's happening around you. And they sit themselves on a set of artifacts. So this is the messages, the accounts, the connections between them, the groups, etc. And you're defending, you're generally working from the artifacts upwards, working out what the narratives are, looking for those incidents, working out what connects to campaigns. If you're creating this, you get to see all of the pyramid. So that's the basic layers. This is another model of those layers. So this is the disinformation version of sticks. So we added an instant object and a narrative object, but we're just showing intrusion checks and malware here. They're not quite equivalent, close enough. And again, you've got that campaign level. So you've got the campaign itself, but you've got the threat actors within it. So this is where attribution lives. The incident. So you have the instance, you have connected instance, but within that instance, you also have behaviors. So both the behaviors of the incident creator, so things like the creating and using hashtags, using fake videos, but also the response behaviors. So the courses of action, the debunking, they both belong to incidents. Narratives can belong to multiple incidents, multiple campaigns. So they tend to get modeled on their own too. And then that artifact layer, in this case, we're looking at accounts, real people, hashtags, but all that data you have sitting around. There are also equivalences in vulnerabilities, indicators, infrastructures. There's work to be done there. There are groups working on indicators. We're looking at vulns, looking at infrastructure. So some of you, if you come from disinformation, will have seen the other models like active behavior content. So this is how that sticks model maps across there. So this is threat actors, threat act behaviors, and content across here. So narrative is sitting off. The debunking, the response actions are outside that mapping. Amit, we've spoken about a lot. So this is a disinformation version of the kill chain stroke attack model. So you have tactic stages, from planning stages, then all of the pieces you need to develop before disinformation hits the wider population in the execution stages. And then you have evaluation. If you're running sets of incidents, so this is a view of an incident from the creator side, then you're probably going to do M&E to make the next one better. And this works the same as attack. Click on the tiles, see what you've got. Each one of these we have lists of counters for, we have lists of indicators for, we have descriptions for, we have examples. So not much more to say about that. But this is the other Amit model. So the first one is now the Amit red model. This is the Amit blue model. So we also mapped all of the response behaviors we saw, and we mapped those into the same stages. This is an early copy. It's actually cleaned up a bit since then, but 160 odd different ways to counter a disinformation campaign. So once you have these two pieces, you can start doing things like gaming. These have been used by the people behind Harmony Square and the Bad News game to game out disinformation campaigns. Examples of one of the counters, this is Reality Team, and they do counter narratives. So as narratives emerge, they create counter narratives and push those into spaces where the disinformation is. So I'm going to hand over to Roger now, who's going to talk about disinformation SOCs and the real-time operation within them.
Thanks, Esther. So as Esther mentioned, in Enablement, we're looking at the frameworks and models that we're going to use to describe our problem. But when we get to real-time operations, we actually need to build the thing. So we're going to take our findings and actually implement that into some type of structure we can use to solve these problems. Next slide. So the first thing to look at here are the three pillars of a SOC, which are usually defined as people, process, and technology. And this model doesn't change with cognitive security. We still need enough people and resources to achieve our strategic objectives. And our people need to be equipped with the right processes, technology, connections, and interfaces to be effective. Cognitive security is information security. So we'll see that much of the processes and technologies are similar, though with disinformation response, speed is essential to our success. And we need our people and the processes to be fast enough to notice these events at scale and to be able to do something about them in time. On this slide, we've broken out culture from people to emphasize the importance of health and safety, including OPSEC when working on cognitive security. Because tactical disinformation response is like rocket fuel for burnout. And organizations building a cognitive security team need to appreciate that these influence operations are designed to exploit humans, and that responders working on these problems are not immune to the digital harms they encounter. So there's special consideration that needs to be made for the care of the responders, but also the people they interface with. So marketing, legal, HR, and any organizations that they'll be in contact with this material. Next slide, please. So one of the first issues we're running into with a disinformation SOC is the idea of organization boundaries. And the responsibility for monitoring and these action boundaries don't align with each other as with a traditional SOC. So unlike the bulk of InfoSec work, when you're monitoring systems outside of your own responsibility and control, you can't directly act against the issues in these spaces. You can only counter or ask other organizations to act. So for example, if we want to ban accounts or deplatform some accounts or content, we're not going to be able to do that ourselves. We can't log into Twitter and delete these accounts. We need to ask the owners to do this for us. And there might be time delays or friction in that process. Internally, we also have action boundaries or organization boundaries for the things we can do. Our SOC needs to interface with other business units, including marketing, communications, and development teams, and other connected organizations, possibly even the InfoSec SOC itself, if the two are separate. So next slide, please. So our work on cognitive security includes adapting useful InfoSec tooling and processes to work with disinformation response. And it's been an effective strategy because cognitive security is an information security problem. So the frameworks, like those for creating a SOC and assessing their maturity, just need to be adapted to include cognitive security functions. But the majority of the work is actually unchanged. And this slide shows the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, or ENISA, their SOC lifecycle model, which is an iterative phase-based model for developing a SOC or a CSIRT. And ENISA publishes guidelines on this process, which you can find on their website. And we can use this lifecycle to create a new SOC or to augment an existing one with cognitive security functions we're interested in. So within each phase, we'll include some cognitive security requirements to affect our desired outcome, and just kind of step through what this process looks like. So at the assessment phase, the first thing we need to consider when creating a disinformation SOC is its purpose. And our SOC may coordinate large-scale incidents between states, such as on election security, or act as a sectoral information clearinghouse and establish norms related to sharing foreign and domestic information threats. But at smaller scales, we might just be addressing corporate risk management scenarios relating to branding, social media influencers, or C-level executives. So as we saw in previous slides, there's a range of responses and sizes that we're looking at. And regardless, this model will fit with what we want. So we need to identify stakeholders and define our mandate and authority. When the networks we're defending exist in the hearts and minds of the public, we need to be aware of laws that restrain how we respond, as well as the organizational boundaries we'll interface through. And at the core of this phase of assessment for readiness is defining the preliminary mandate, which includes the SOC's strategic, operational, and tactical responsibilities, as well as our budget and governance structure. So in practice, what we're doing here is we're asking the question, what do we need to accomplish? The next phase is the design phase, where we're planning our SOC services, the processes, workflows, our technology and infrastructure requirements, as well as management planning to fulfill the responsibilities defined in our mandate. And the goal here is to take the strategic objectives defined in the first phase and then plan our SOC capabilities, how to implement them, and their relationship to each other, if any. So at this point, we need to understand our organization boundaries really well and how they relate to the SOC services and functions. If we get them wrong, we're going to kind of screw up these actual services. But luckily for us, a lot of the cognitive security functions we'll want to develop fit inside of traditional SOC capabilities. So the amount of work to include CogSec functions in a threat intelligence team, for example, is far lower than the work needed to go and create and equip that team from scratch. The next phase during implementation, we hire staff, create the services, processes, workflows, technology, and management procedures previously defined. And depending on our mandate, we need to hire cognitive security specialists to assist in the implementation of these processes and workflows, to refine plans, work with the IT to implement technology requirements such as data collection, warehousing, and automation. And the implementation also should include agreements with our partners and stakeholders. And again, this is especially important along our organization boundaries, where if we don't have proper sharing arrangements or agreements in place, we end up getting bottlenecked by inefficiencies in these interfaces. Next, we have the operations phase, which is focused on KPIs to measure performance on service delivery. And what this looks like is highly dependent on the mandate, but we're essentially asking ourselves if we're doing the right things and if the things we're doing, if we're doing them the right way. Finally, during the improvement phase, we're identifying new projects or capabilities we need to develop, enhance, or refactor. And provided the capability fits with our mandate budget, we go back to the design phase and repeat the process. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is an image of the first.org CCERT services framework, and it shows SOC service areas from which we'll derive our SOC capabilities. And these service areas are high level, and they simply group together like functions or like capabilities of a SOC. So within each area are the specific sets of activities that we're interested in. And when we look at these, we'll notice that a lot of the first service area functions are relevant to cognitive security. For example, under Information Security Event Management, the functions of monitoring and detecting events, which in a traditional SOC might be performed by a SIM, are activities we perform when monitoring social media feeds or other data sources like news sites or chat rooms or whatever. And in fact, all of these service areas are interesting to us. Within each one, we'll find functions that are immediately relevant, such as crisis management, or need some amount of modification to be useful or understood in the frame of CogSec, such as vulnerability analysis. But the point here, and what I'm really trying to demonstrate by walking through this, is that a lot of resources go into building the processes and infrastructures of a SOC. But since cognitive security is an information security problem, it's relatively simple to start implementing cognitive security functions as iterative improvements that build on what we already have. And for the past year and a half, that's exactly what we've done at CogSec Collab, working with groups to iteratively refine and build capabilities, that are built on skills that people in the industry already have or are developing. Next slide, please. So finally, let's look at what some of these functions are. And most SOCs perform some kind of monitoring and detection. Typically, we see event logs in a SIM or a big data platform, maybe something like Elastic. And for us, our interesting data inputs are things like social media, news, other channels. So there are technical implementation details that are different, right? How do we, let's say, pull this data from Twitter or whatever? But the processes for acting on these inputs is actually very similar. For threat intelligence, it also looks very similar. Analysts are still going to consume intelligence reports and news and major events relating to cognitive security, and summarize and share their findings out to the SOC and to organization interfaces, just as they'll perform threat assessment on these actors and activities. During incident response, countermeasures help us mitigate risk and deny, disrupt, or degrade adversary capabilities. And some countermeasures may exist outside of our organization boundaries, like banning social media accounts. Other countermeasures, like counter messaging, may not be possible due to regulation. For example, some governments may not be able to have counter messaging campaigns against their domestic population. And incident responders will also work with threat intel analysts to understand adversary tradecraft and to observe adversary behaviors that can help inform detection and mitigation strategies. And an example of what that might look like is pulling artifacts such as advertising tags out of sites, looking for similar uses of words or account creation artifacts, and linking together campaigns that you might not have otherwise known or related based on simply the content of their messaging. And with the artifact analysis, we're interested in things like deepfake detection and file metadata. And a notable, interesting example of this is the mishandling of metadata by the social media site Parler. And because photo and video geodata was not scrubbed, it was possible to reconstruct a map of timeline and user activities during the January 6th attack on the US Capitol building. Now the technical skills required to do this thing are probably ones you can find in virtually any SOC. It's essentially trivial to pull out this geodata from a file. But for us, it's still extremely interesting because we're able to reconstruct these events and say factually that yes, certain people were inside the building when things went down and so on. Okay, next slide, please. So we haven't looked at the internal structure of a SOC yet. And this is an example of a tiered model that shows a couple services and their interfaces. And there are many ways to do this depending on your size and mandate. And there's no strict requirement that services and functions are exclusively designated to cognitive security. Often we'll see tiers in a traditional SOC within a single service area. So for example, triage might have one or more tiers, as will incident response, and interfaces out to specialty services to reduce bottlenecks in how and when those people are contacted. Next slide, please. And the one question that comes up is where do we actually put our disinformation SOC and how does it fit in our organization? And there are lots of options, just as there are lots of options in how you actually build it and configure it. These are some examples ranging from a large dedicated SOC, such as the Cognitive Security ISAO, to a small team. And each one is connected to other organizations and functions along the boundaries or interfaces. And this is just us working out how to connect the SOC to an existing InfoSec SOC, as well as a single cognitive security desk within smaller organizations. Okay, so next slide, please. So now we've talked a lot about the structure of a SOC, and hopefully you're thinking that all of this looks suspiciously familiar, and it should, because cognitive security is an information security problem. So something we haven't yet addressed, though, is resource allocation within a SOC. So even though lots of the services and functions and the processes and frameworks and everything we're going to use are very, very familiar, we still need to put special consideration into how we allocate our resources to achieve our strategic objectives. Because one of the greatest challenges we'll face in cognitive security response is being fast enough to make a difference in time. It's no good if you put out messaging after a target audience has been radicalized or after an election has been influenced. So we need to be fast identifying events and doing something about them before they have their intended effect on their target. And if we want to be fast, we need to think about how we allocate our resources. And all actors have limited resources, limited infrastructure, time, and capabilities that they can allocate, including us. So we need to identify what it is that we want to protect, or what it is that we can, which resources of our adversary that we can waste to prevent them from their intended effect. So this happens on both sides. And we'll also need to think about extending capacity and surge capacity. So to the point of being fast, if we have a small triaged team, but many SMEs or many highly technical individuals, chances are good that we will not accomplish our objective if we need to deal with a massive amount of data. So where we allocate human resources, how much attention is put on machine learning and automation capacity is super important, just for being able to do the heavy lifting here. Okay, so next slide, please. So as we mentioned, we've adapted some tools over time. One of the big ones is MISP, which is a popular open source information sharing platform. MISP is used by a bunch of certs and companies and governments, and it supports the Emmet framework out of the box. So if you want to experiment using Emmet TTPs and events, you can download MISP from their site and get going with it. The link here is actually for the MISP or Circles training material for MISP that'll explain exactly how to use it. And CogSec Collab actually operates a MISP instance, which you can request to join through our website. Next slide, please. Okay, one more example of tool adaptation is OpenCTI. As SJ was talking about in a previous slide, we have STIX model objects for Emmet and many incidents we've worked on. OpenCTI is based on the STIX data format. So if your organization is used to STIX or needs to work with STIX, this might be an attractive option for you. And Emmet is also available as a connector in the OpenCTI platform. So you can download this product, it's free, and get going with Emmet today. So that's it, back to you, Esther.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about theory, we've kind of hinted we do practical stuff too, so this is one of them. So this is assessing a disinformation risk in a country, designing the response frameworks around a SOC design for it. So, information landscapes. We're talking a place with traditional media. There's not much in the way of newspapers. There's a lot of radio. That includes community radio, which isn't necessarily state controlled, but is linked to the monitors, and TV. Social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, a little bit, YouTube, Telegram, tiny bit. But most of this is carried on Facebook and WhatsApp. So I talked about information seeking behaviors over Facebook, information sharing behaviors on WhatsApp. There's also word of mouth. We're talking large rural areas where there's radio, but there isn't that much in the way of signal. So stuff is getting from social media to radio to population via word of mouth. Threats landscape. Not seeing much country on country stuff, which is wonderful. It's been a while. I'm seeing a lot of party politics. There are a bunch of actors in that threat landscape. There are a bunch of activities that they're doing. A lot of, create disinformation, create more drama, a lot of manipulation of specific communities. And there is a bunch of specific risks. I obviously haven't listed the actors and risks here. Sources, so where this is stuff originating, again, WhatsApp messages, blogs, Facebook, some online newspapers, some media, even the good media sometimes gets fooled. And the routes coming out. So how is this getting to people? We're seeing hijacks of narratives. Remember I said earlier about people jumping on top of disinformation narratives. We're also seeing them jumping on top of information narratives and twisting. And WhatsApp up to blogs, blogs to WhatsApp. There's a lot of that. And then there's social media, traditional social media, word of mouth. So that social media, radio, people. Type of creative behaviors we've seen. So this is the Amit red model for this country. And we're seeing it's actually fairly sparse. We're seeing fake profiles, we're seeing some fake groups, imposter sites, generally of media organizations. We're seeing a bunch of conspiracy, a bunch of malinformation, so fact distortions. We're seeing amplification through tertiary sites, WhatsApp and Facebook. Somebody once asked why we actually list all the channels. And one of the reasons is it's useful if you're looking at counters, if there are counters that are specific to a channel. So that's about the landscape. It's fairly clean. And looking at the response landscape. So looking at what is out there in terms of response. So what is needed because of the disinformation landscape, the work that exists, the gaps between them. And then this is looking at those three levels. So the risk reduction work, a lot of information literacy work, fair bit of information landscaping. There's some other risk reduction happening in country. Monitoring work, there are groups monitoring radio and TV, a little bit on newspapers. There's groups who monitor some of social media. Again, this is very subject specific or organization specific. A lot of the information coming in is coming in through tip lines. Analysis, so tier 1 to tier 4. So we're seeing a lot of tier 3 analysis. So we're basically seeing reports being created over days. That, again, remember I said about strategic versus tactical. So we're seeing a lot of strategic analysis going on. We're seeing tier 2, we're seeing mitigations like government announcements and stuff like that. We're also seeing groups that are almost purely tier 1. So they do the triage, create the tickets, and that goes to someone else. So tier 4, there are different networks of coordination. So we're seeing some tier 4. We're not seeing disinformation response plans anywhere because most of the response is to misinformation. So it's a different beastie. So there are gaps there. Response itself, so we're seeing some pre-bunking, a bunch of debunking, we're seeing counter narratives being pushed out, we're seeing amplification of information signals in the spaces disinformation is in. Not quite the same as counter narrative, because counter narrative is generally looking at a disinformation narrative and pushing out. And we're seeing the usual platform actions of things like account and group removal, and some other actions behind that. When we looked at response, we also looked at the reach. So not just what is this, but how far does it get, which populations, things like that word of mouth. There are groups that will go out to communities and do word of mouth responses. Responder behavior, so this is the Amit blue model for this. So we're looking at the groups educating influencers, The two highlighted are the things that we think need to be strengthened. So a shared fact-checking database and a strong government, private sector dialogue cooperation. But there are lots of interesting bits. So there's an influencer code of conduct in country, which was nice to find. Again, we're seeing people looking for truth in those narratives, amplifying those. Again, journalism standards, those media literacy, news environment, there's been some good work on creating a better environment. So again, when I said that you have always to think of the information environment as well as the disinformation environment. If you take out disinformation, you're leaving holes, you're leaving voids. You need to think how to fill those. So Amit Red, Amit Blue, we have a model where we can click the Amit Reds or the Amit Blues and see the corresponding set. So we've just looked at the overlap between these, done the gaps. The resource allocation, in looking at those needs, those groups, looking at those with the Amit labels, looking at better collaboration mechanisms. There are lots of tip lines there for different things. We think that sometimes tips go to places that it's not their area, so we want to reduce lossage across that. We're also interested in potential future. So if they do attract the attention of other countries, if they do get a disinformation problem, if they have surges, design for those. Don't just design for the problem you have right now. And as part of this, the group I'm working with have been really quite forward. So they've been producing and designing machine learning based solutions to reduce down the load. I'm going to show a diagram in a second and just talk through some of the load balancing in there. So basic coordination on this, generally misinformation based. So you're sitting here, you've got the tips coming in. The guys in yellow, these are groups that are not part of the collective. So we needed to build a way for them to share as well, and to share those resources we have. So we have everything from information about disinformation instance. So you've got campaigns instance, narratives, artifacts, but also information stores. So one of the things we found was that access to information wasn't even. You have people who don't have access to the principles involved with information, or they're looking online. They have limited capacities. So sharing that. Another store sitting inside this is quite often counter narratives are produced and other resources for countering. So it's good to have those. So for the left side, you've got public comes in, you've got social media, so you're doing channel searches, outputs to slope style sites, but also direct outputs out to other groups. And sitting in the middle of this is the engines. This is just a top level view. We've put the MEDAN system in the middle because they are a good analysis support system, a good place to base from. But we've also got a lot of data coming through, so we have to do that tier 1 triage somewhere. So the tier 1 triage in this is a combination of human and automation. And we're using those disinformation data stores to change the channel search parameters and also to filter the search and tips. We have mostly human in here, but there's also some interesting automation, so some good clustering in there, which is useful. And that is a pretty simple system. So we've got inputs, tier 1, tier 2, stroke a little tier 3. We've got tier 3 over here, and tier 4 is hanging this lot together. So thank you very much. We've enjoyed talking to you about disinformation risk analysis and disinformation SOCs and some of the practical applications. So, talking about getting people to work together, one thing else we've also been working on is this idea of disinformation SOCs. So security